climate denial and environmental protests, how the First Amendment is protecting corporations over democracy in America. So what does this mean? Where did I start this project? As some of you may know, Trump got elected recently, and that messed me up quite a bit. It got me thinking about what reality was and how reality is constructed, and if we can figure reality out, which I don't think we can, who controls that, who controls knowledge. So it seems like a lot of people are shouting into the abyss really loudly because everyone wants the reality confirmed. My roommate Anya is shouting about art history and objectivity and archives. My parents are shouting about how they want me to come home. And I'm shouting about climate change and biodiversity loss and systems of oppression and how much I hate cars. My supervisor Kevin is also shouting about this. Greg Michelson and Kathy Roulet and Molly Lalonde and most people in this room are shouting about this. And yet, the shouting in politics is all just James Comey is shouting about Paul Ryan, shouting about Kellyanne Conway, shouting about Paul Manafort, shouting about tax cuts in Syria and the Russia stuff and scandals. And why is no one talking about climate change in a big way? So, climate change. It's real. It exists. 97% of scientists agree on this. We all probably agree on this reality. Most of the world agrees on this. Even alt-right groups in Europe that have ethnic cleansing agendas are on the same page here. Climate change is real and a big deal, and we need to do something about our behavior now. But in American politics, this discourse just isn't a reality. Despite 97% of scientists being on the same page, only 13% of Americans realize this unanimity. Despite 90% of scientists being on the same page, only 58% of Americans believe climate change is human-related. On average, about 4 in every 10 Americans don't believe in human-related climate change. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, which 4 of you guys don't believe in climate change? Good joke. This is a comic of ExxonMobil pouring information into George Bush, who was representing the U.S. government here, in his ears, and he's saying, I have been informed from a reliable source that this global warming is nothing but junk science. Which is a comic that kind of cuts to the core of a lot of what I want to talk about. One author I was reading argued that the climate change counter-movement is a well-orchestrated, well-funded strategy to undermine climate science so as to enable fossil fuel industries to prosper. So my project focuses, so this is, I haven't fixed it yet, this is going to be a different diagram later. My project focuses on this question. In America, how does information get from the agreed-upon scientific reality to an informed public and political sphere? I hope to use this diagram to, but not this one, like the one that I will have up, to point out the relevant actors in the process. So over here is scientific information, facts, and knowledge. Over here is an informed public and political policy. And all of this stuff, I'm trying to figure out, what is going on in here? How do we get from there to over there? So there's individuals, there's corporations, there's lobbying, think tanks, the First Amendment. How does all of this come together? I'll come back to this at the very end, and hopefully it will make more sense then. There's 2 main parts to my project. The first looks at corporations and asks what rights are granted to corporations under the First Amendment, and the second looks at individuals and asks what rights are granted to individuals under the First Amendment. Then I go on to look at what implications this has when we talk specifically about environmental issues. Okay, so this is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Does anyone know what that means? Can anyone tell me what that means? Do we have any constitutional scholars here? Can anyone tell me what that means? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if you think you can, you're wrong. Because no one knows what this means. It's a lot of vague words, and the Supreme Court has actually been involved in dozens of cases since the 1800s trying to figure out what this means. And even today, we're still messing with it. So this project specifically is going to be focusing on the parts that say freedom of speech and what that means and what the right of the people to peaceably assemble means. Let's start with corporations. So corporations exist to profit their shareholders. It is impossible for corporations to be driven by morality and ethics. They only align with ethical concerns when ethical decisions align with profiting shareholders. Additionally, proponents of free market capitalism assume that all cost factors will be accounted for. So, when the market fails to account for all cost factors, there is a need for legislative correction. One author argues that the legislative process is the only mechanism for solving market failures in democratic nations. Because there is a severe lack of accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, it makes logical sense that the legislative branch should get involved in the economic market. However, forcing companies to pay for their greenhouse gas emissions does not increase profit, and therefore corporations, especially fossil fuel corporations, are vehemently against such regulations. So under the First Amendment, money is considered speech. There's this concept called corporate personhood, protected under the First Amendment, where corporations are treated as individuals when donating money. Therefore, corporations are allowed to donate to political campaigns, fund advertising, think tanks, media organizations, and lobbyists. But corporations are not always considered individuals under the First Amendment, and are allowed to, for example, they're allowed to borrow public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management for $1.50 per acre per year and extract minerals on that land. This is often done without the consent of surrounding municipalities and often leads to direct pollution in surrounding municipalities that are not offered compensation. So to put this in perspective, individuals are allowed to camp out on BLM land between 1 to 3 months depending on the location and are not allowed to extract any resources. So onwards, dark money. What is dark money? That sounds ominous already. Basically, it's money that's donated to organizations that can't be traced. The Donors Trust is a group that donates untraceable money to climate change counter-movement organizations. In recent years, the decrease in donations from organizations like ExxonMobil and Koch Enterprises matches the donations coming from Donors Trust, suggesting that this money may still be coming from these corporations after all, but it's just more secret now. So, next part. Oh, here's a great picture of beautiful background where there's mining happening on public land. So what are think tanks? Think tanks are defined as organizations developed, governed, and funded by U.S. corporate community, both to shape public opinion and, just as importantly, develop and advocate for policies that will benefit the wealthiest Americans. So in the same way that corporate political activity cannot work against their shareholders and cannot work against gaining profits, think tanks cannot be bastions of radical political thought that don't focus on profits above else. So they have to be focusing on profits. Much work has been done tracing how think tanks have intentionally sought to mislead the American body politic about the existence of climate change. There's little doubt of this intentional causation, especially in an effort to normalize climate change denial. But I wanted to take a bit more of a nuanced approach to this. So what if corporations, or what if think tanks, which some of them are talking about climate change and are trying to look for solutions? So can they do work for public good is a question I asked, and do they have any interest in doing so? While think tanks are almost always economically conservative, preaching free market capitalism and corporate rights to the body politic, there is no doubt that think tanks exist that don't deny climate change. Instead, these think tanks go as far as advocating for limited climate mitigation, for adapting new climate realities with a focus on privileged accommodation and climate opportunism. These think tanks concede a few climate mitigation points in order to keep benefiting the elite through adapting new industries based around climate change, such as development along the receding Arctic permafrost. While these think tanks are not directly misinforming the public, they do seek to push elite-driven policies through capitalism. What?
1 minute left.
Well, now the second part of my presentation is about individuals, so I guess I'll have to cut a bunch of that stuff. I'll try and speed up. So, individuals, there are protest laws that are being pushed through the states in the last couple of years. So, in the last couple of years, 31 states have considered anti-protest laws, so making it harder to protest. So 62 bills in total have been proposed. Of those 62 bills, 7 have been enacted and 30 are still pending. The last bill proposed was on March 28th, 2018, so just a couple weeks ago in Louisiana. And so this is a very currently unresolved issue, and this is something that is really important right now. So one of the main states that's been affected by this is South Dakota, which had the Dakota Access Pipeline protest camp situated on it. And during that was when these 4 laws were passed. So one of them was new penalties for protesters. It should say protesters. New penalties for protesters who conceal their identity. So that can include if you have a misdemeanor while you're jaywalking and you have your hood up, you could be charged with a felony for that. The next one is expanded scope of criminal trespass. So it can be charged if there's a group of people on private property, even if it just looks kind of problematic, judged by officials, and no one's even complained about it. So it's policing what's happening on private property. The third is heightened penalties for riot offenses, so changing these offenses from misdemeanors to felonies. And the last one, which I think is maybe one of the more invasive ones, which mandated that there was an evacuation of the Dakota Access Pipeline protest camp. Another law that was proposed, the House Bill 1203, eliminating driver liability for hitting protesters. So that was defeated, which was good, but there's 2 current laws still pending in Kentucky and North Carolina that have yet to be voted down targeting this. So it's pretty real. So here's the slide again. Now I've gone through how it works. This again is the wrong picture, but this is some of the actors here. So here are kind of my main takeaways from this project. So I think that we should get rid of corporate personhood benefits and stop letting corporations extract minerals on public land. We should listen to protesters, we should listen to scientists, we should make real climate policy action, and we should enjoy the scenery before we all die. So just want to thank Kevin Manaugh, who damage controlled my emotional breakdowns, helped me narrow down existential crises, and yes, supervised my thesis. Thank you. I'd like to thank my roommates who had to hear about how I've been working on my thesis all day, somehow without getting any tangible work done, and who have all run down to the depth to resupply my hot Cheeto addiction. And I'd like to thank McGill for teaching me that it doesn't exist to cultivate my personal growth. Thanks.